We will be muting you as you come on. But don't panic, because what we'll do is we will use the chat feature. If everybody's familiar with that, it should be at the bottom of your screen. You can open up the chat feature. I've already popped in there for you a link to our strategic plan and a link to our annual report and a link to the agenda for tonight. So you'll find all of that in the chat feature. And then we will be using the chat to take questions after Sam and Julian have their discussion back and forth. So that will be how we'll be handling most of the questions. You can also use the raise hand feature when we get to that part of the meeting. But I think, Kathy, we're ready to go ahead. So if you would like to go ahead with the welcome.
I will do that indeed. So we're going to start the evening with board business and a report from the director, and then we will invite our speaker tonight to join us. So I'd like to call the annual meeting of the Essex Library Board of Trustees to order. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kathy Bonamy, president of the board. I'm happy to announce some important news. In early October, the board completed a 9-month strategic planning process and unanimously approved a strategic plan that will take the library through the year 2026. Information on the plan will be posted on the website shortly, and it will also be made available at the library. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank our consultant, Patty Dowling, for her expert guidance through the process, and to the staff and volunteers, the friends of the library, and the many members of the community who provided feedback. Your participation has been essential, and your hopes for the library's future really inspiring to all of us involved. I'd like to thank our donors for their support over the course of a bumpy year. There's no doubt things would have looked very differently for the library without it. And special thanks goes to the late Barry Fulford, who so generously included the library in his will with one of the largest gifts in our history. Mr. Fulford was active with the library in his lifetime as well, serving as trustee for 6 years and donating to us his extensive biographical collection of biographies. Prompted by the new financial pressures on the library, our executive director and the board's treasurer and development committee have also been proactive in seeking support from federal and state, as well as private and corporate sources. As a result, we received PPP money this year and last, and were awarded several grants to offset the cost of the new protocols, the furnishings and other equipment, and otherwise adapt to the shifting circumstances we live in now. Finally, I'd like to express our gratitude to the 3 trustees who are stepping down tonight. Nancy McDonald brought her wide experience in the educational field to bear on the board's proceedings. And as you can see by the long list of capital improvements and repairs in the annual report, Gary Riggio provided crucial counsel on all matters concerning the facility. Rita Christopher has served for 2 terms, one of them as president of the board, leading us through hard times while leavening the meetings with humor and wit. Thank you, Rita. Our nominating chair, Michael Hammond, will present the slate of new trustees for the coming term. But first, I'll turn things over to the Essex Library Director, Deborah Smith.
Thank you, Kathy. I just launched a poll, which you will see on your screen. It's actually the first of 3 polls that we will have tonight. And we're hoping that you can give us a sense of how many people are watching with you tonight. I want to thank you all for joining this annual meeting of the Essex Library Association. I'm Deb Smith, Executive Director of the library, and it's an honor this evening to welcome our new members to the Board of Trustees and enjoy a question and answer keynote with special guest Julian Zelizer. First, I'm going to quickly share with you some of the highlights from the past year. You'll find more details in our annual report, and that link is in the chat bar. The report is also available at www.youressexlibrary.org, and printed copies are here at the library. There's been a pandemic learning curve for the library again this year, but staff have proven up to the challenge. We've learned to manage the strains placed on operations during COVID-19, and we ended with a strong year at the library. 13 months ago, the library fully reopened for in-person visits. We hosted 16,633 visits to the building between August 2020 and June 2021. Last fall, we welcomed new staff to our team in Children's and Outreach Services. We also partnered with area schools, providing employment for 4 area teams. Our extensive programming continued in both virtual and small group formats. Many of our Zoom programs attracted more than 100 attendees. We held over 250 programs and activities, reaching more than 8,100 attendees. In the spring, students at Connecticut Coastal Academy designed and built a little free library for the library's grounds. And if you haven't seen it, I hope you will stop by. The structure replicates the library's architecture and is a popular resource for area children. Our service focus in 2020-21 aimed to mitigate the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We launched a library of things to loan Google Chromebooks, Wi-Fi hotspots, tools, interview accessories, toys, and games. Last January, we received a $3,000 American Library Association grant for a 6-part book discussion on income inequality. And I am delighted to share that we have just been selected as one of a very few libraries across the country for an additional $3,000 grant from ALA to continue this work, this time with a series on the impact of climate change on income inequality. You will look for those discussions next April. We received several other grants during the year, including funding provided through the American Rescue Plan Act, which has enabled us to purchase new furniture that supports more flexible meeting configurations and individual study. Board President Kathy Bonamy has just shared the exciting news that our new strategic plan is now approved by the board and ready for implementation. The staff and I are excited to move forward in realization of the plan's goals over the next few years. From a financial perspective, the library is on solid ground. For fiscal year 2021, our actual revenues exceeded what we had conservatively budgeted, giving us an important financial cushion to operate during what has become an extended pandemic. You may recall that our endowment suffered a serious loss in March of 2020. I'm pleased to share that through prudent fiscal management and a strong market, we have more than made up that loss. We began the year with $3 million in the endowment and ended in June with almost $4 million. Funding from our endowment, the town of Essex, and donors like you enabled us to partner with more than 25 community organizations, host 31,000 visits to our website, and circulate more than 32,000 items, all in a pandemic year. I want to extend a special thank you to you, the members of the association, our donors, patrons, and volunteers. Without your support and engagement, we could not provide a consistently high level of services, programs, and collections from year to year. Your gifts make a difference every day to the library and to our community. I look forward to another great year at Essex Library, and thank you. I'm going to turn it now over to Mike Hammond, who should be available here on. Anne, can you see if we can activate Mike's microphone?
Thanks, Deb. I don't know if you can hear me or if there's a lag.
We can hear you fine, Michael.
Okay. I'd like to submit into nomination so the nominating committee has conducted a search for new trustees to serve a term commencing in October of 2021. I keep getting a poll popping up. Anyway, to serve a 3-year term commencing October 2021. And I'd like to move the slate of nominees for the trustees if I can. Is that okay, Kathy?
Yes.
Okay, so the board has approved the recommendation for each of the nominees to become members of the Board of Trustees. Elizabeth Reinhardt, you can wave if you, once I say your name, Jill Schwartzman, and Pamela Surface. And we would like to have them stand for election to the Board of Trustees, commencing October, for a term commencing October 2021 for a term of 3 years. Do I have a second for the nomination?
Lots of seconds.
Okay, and can we call for a vote?
Yep. And Mike, we're also hoping you can mention that you and Peter McAndrew are up for second term. So
Thank
the
you.
vote includes.
Yeah, thank you for the reminder. I also move the second term nomination for Michael Hammond, and for Peter as well.
We're getting some votes in.
Okay.
Wonderful. We've actually just
And everyone is eligible to vote.
everyone who's an association member who gave $35 or more since June 1, 2020 is eligible to vote. And it looks like we have just exceeded our vote. So that's great. We've exceeded the required threshold in the bylaws, but we will keep the poll open a little longer in case anyone else wants to participate. And I think we'll now end the poll and I will share the poll.
We've got a couple of people who are just coming in.
So I think you can see that congratulations, everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for participating. I think we can move now to adjourn the meeting of the, let me just see here, adjourn the meeting of the 2020 to 2021 Board of Trustees. And I'd like to call to order the meeting of the 2021 to 2022 Board of Trustees. And turn things back to Michael for nominating.
Thanks, Kathy. So my task is to nominate the following slate of directors. And this would be voted on just by the trustees themselves, and the members are obviously welcome to witness the election of the board. But so again, we're nominating Kathy Bonamy as president, Betsy Sandberg as vice president, Michael DeLucre as treasurer, and Sandra Cahill as secretary. Do I have a second?
Second,
Okay.
the poll is
And-
up.
Put that poll up. Yeah. This is great. So I'm going to now post that poll. And congratulations. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
So it is.
Go
sorry.
ahead, Deb.
And thank you, Mike, and thank you, Kathy. So now we move over to the good stuff, and it is my great privilege to introduce tonight our special guest speakers. Sam Tannenhouse is a journalist and historian, now completing the authorized biography of William F. Buckley Jr. And tonight, Sam will be guiding our Q&A discussion with Julian Zelizer. So thank you, Sam.
Pleasure.
Julian Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He is a frequent commentator on the international and national media on political history and contemporary politics. In fact, when I recently mentioned to someone that Julian would be here tonight, that person said immediately, "I've seen him on CNN." And indeed you have. He is also the author of several books, including Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party, and on Capitol Hill, The Struggle to Reform Congress and Its Consequences 1948 to 2000. Dr. Zelizer's newest biography, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, about the Jewish thinker and civil rights leader, is published in October 2020, just this month, by Yale University Press. And Sam, I think you have a copy of the book. Would you be able to hold it up to us and say, yeah, the newest book, which I understand Julian was just launching yesterday at a large Zoom call and an in-person event. So welcome, Julian, and thank you so much for sharing your time with the library tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks everyone else. Beginning with Julian, I have to say, if there's anybody in America who could write books about Newt Gingrich and Rabbi Heschel, it's Julian, and we have him here tonight. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with everyone.
I should tell our audience one reason it's great to have you is because I think of you as maybe the foremost historian right now of the modern American Congress. And a few years ago, people didn't talk or think so much about Congress. Everything was centered on presidents. And you were in this kind of wave of historians that kind of helped us see that the Constitution begins by telling us Article 1 is about Congress. Congress makes the laws. Here we are at a moment right now, you can, turn on the television and see it, where all the talk is about the Senate, the House, these enormous bills that are being presented and debated over in very detailed ways that even a year ago, people who thought they knew something about politics wouldn't have been able to comprehend. And now we all kind of do. So what I want you, hope that you can do right now is tell us, when you look at this moment, what are the big historical stakes? Let's set aside the partisan ones. Is this really kind of a moment of truth for the American legislative process? And if so, what should we be looking for right now?
Well, that's a good question. And it's true how much attention there is on Congress. Senators Manchin and Sinema are in the national spotlight, probably more than President Biden right now. I had a student the other day who said he wanted to write a paper on reconciliation and the process, which I've never had a student ask me that before, certainly not in the sense of legislative processes. And so people are paying attention. They're looking at the filibuster. There's all these questions in the air. Some of what's at stake is if you are in agreement that we are at a moment when the nation faces a series of crises that have been unresolved for over a decade, whether it's climate change, immigration, infrastructure. This is a test. The conditions are probably as good as they're going to get in the near term for producing legislation. And so now we see, can the system produce that legislation? Can it produce the legislation in the configuration of politics that we have now? A deep partisan divide, certainly a Republican Party that's not planning to cooperate generally with the administration. And can the system work? The second historical moment is what I said a few minutes ago, that a lot of the ways that Congress works are suddenly of interest. And people are starting to ask questions about the different processes that seem to guide legislative decisions. There's been a lot of ink spilled on the filibuster. Now reconciliation is this odd term that is coming to life as it plays out in a dramatic battle between different elements of the Democratic Party. And I think there's a question, does the system kind of remain as it is, or does this open some kind of window for actually maybe making the Senate a more majoritarian institution in its decision-making, gutting some of the sources of obstruction that have really bogged down the Senate in recent years? Or does the system pretty much remain in place? Biden gets what he can out of Congress, and we move on with the same configuration. And I think those are two of the big questions right now. And obviously a third, which came up during the Trump years, and in terms of the former president's relationship with congressional Republicans, is this the modern state of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill? Does Trump in many ways reflect where the party has moved? And we see that through the congressional caucus, from Senator McConnell to some of the Freedom Caucus people in the House of Representatives.
Julian, what about the relationship between the Senate and the House right now? Do you see parallels? Can we turn the clock back, or can you turn it back and say, well, there was a moment when there were conflicts that resemble these? Do we have a more ideological House than we do Senate? How does all that play out in this moment compared to previous times?
I mean, I think what a lot of political scientists say is more that the Senate now works a lot like the House. So, traditionally, historically, there's this image that partisanship doesn't have quite the same hold on the Senate that it does in the House, that you have more breaks in individual senators being loyal or disloyal to the party. Individual senators are more willing to go their own way, that issues like the personal relations between senators in this club matter more than they do in the House, which is a more kind of majoritarian institution. A lot of political scientists say that's just not true anymore, that the Senate has gradually become almost as partisan as the House in how it operates. Party discipline is generally, despite what's going on now with reconciliation, it's pretty strong in the Senate. You don't have senators that often break with high priorities of the party. And a lot of the mechanisms to enforce partisan discipline are at work in the Senate, not just the House, including things like campaign finance and the way rules are used. So we're at a moment where some of the differences have kind of collapsed. And once things move to the Senate, there's not a huge break with where things have been in the House.
If you were to find on a timeline a starting point that took us or began to take us in the place we are now, what era would that be, or what moment would you look at?
It's the 1960s and 70s. I mean, in that era, the major problem that many reformers saw was that there was too much bipartisanship in Congress. And the problem for many liberals, for example, meaning the mainstream of the Democratic Party by that point, was there was a bipartisan coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans who held up issues like Medicare and civil rights. The nature of bipartisan cooperation behind the scenes in smoke-filled committee rooms was not palatable to many younger members, including some younger Republicans as well. And there's a huge push in the 60s, culminating in reforms in the early 70s, in 74 and 75, to make Congress a more partisan institution. And that manifested itself in changes that start in the rules of how the House and Senate work, to the norms, where there's more deference to the majority leader in the Senate, to the speaker as a party leader. Partisanship won out. And it took some time for that to totally come together. But I think that's the era we move very much into where we are today. And it's not just partisanship versus bipartisanship. It's a more open political process that we start to get, even if many people don't like what they see. There's more transparency. There's television cameras literally covering a lot of what goes on. And that was how reformers imagined we'd have a better Congress. And I think many people now, in retrospect, think they missed some of the dysfunction that would come from this new system.
I remember that back in, I think, 1950 or so, when these debates were really starting to emerge after this end of the Second World War, partly because liberal Democrats were looking at how successful the Labour Party was in England, pushing through reforms like national health insurance, nationalizing industries. And they thought, well, why can't we do that here? Why can't we get all our people together and push through these great reforms? And there was kind of an assumption that if you had this more responsible politics, liberal results would come. And I know one person who was skeptical all along was Arthur Schlesinger. He said, what you actually want is this weird combination of Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, who align on different issues and sometimes will give you the better outcome. Is there any way to get back to a system like that? Or is it just a forward-moving train and we're going to become more ideological rather than more bipartisan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's first, I would say that's a good assessment. And Schlesinger was one of the few people who diverted from the conventional wisdom of the period. Much more indicative of where a lot of certainly liberals were was there's a report you're referring to in 1950 by the American Political Science Association, and it basically calls for changing the way Congress works so that partisanship is triumphant and that the parties are coherent rather than disparate factions within each party, and that parties, the argument was, should stand for something. I mean, the argument was if parties don't stand for anything, it's kind of mushy middle and backroom bipartisan compromises, you never get big change other than exceptional moments. And that if they were more coherent, that would be different. And that wins out. Liberals are wrong. I mean, I would argue that Republicans in the end are much better and much more astute at capitalizing on the changes. This is part of the story of Newt Gingrich and really seeing how the new politics worked, and the Republicans in many ways are more effective at using that world against the Democrats. But can it change? That's kind of the big question people ask. I'm not very optimistic you go back to where we were. I mean, I think, we had fundamentally divided parties back then, deeper divisions than exist today even. I mean, even the division between Senators Manchin and Sinema and the rest of the Democratic Party is much different than all of the Southerners in the 1950s and 60s basically aligned against where the rest of their party was. And similarly, the Republican divisions between the Jacob Javitzes of the Republican Party and the Everett Dirksons, it was much more stark. And we're not going to go back to that right now. I mean, I don't see the parties splitting up. And so the parties are going to still be pretty united internally. And that makes it hard to go to a bipartisan period. I think the mechanisms of politics, the changes I referred to that took place in the 70s, I don't know if they're going to be undone. And a lot of them, both within Congress and externally, the way the media works, for example, the impact of social media and cable news, those are not going to change very quickly. There's things that fuel our current politics that unless there's a moment of true reform, like we saw in the progressive era, or we saw in the 1970s, it's going to be more of the same. And probably the ideological differences will only harden rather than soften, because that's the nature of political combat. And I'd add one last thing, is that we live in an age we have since 1994, really, where control of the House and Senate shifts a lot. And there's a political scientist named Frances Lee who's she wrote a really good book about this. She now teaches at Princeton. And the argument was that between, really 1933 to 1994, with a few exceptional moments, Democrats controlled Capitol Hill. And what that allowed was a kind of solidity of Democratic power that actually fueled the willingness to go into bipartisan compromises on certain issues. Whereas today, every decision you make might cost you control of the chamber. And so no one wants to really depart from what seems safe. So these bigger forces aren't going away in 2022, 2023. So unless there's a change in the way politics works, or one party is really able to craft a durable majority, I think this is where we're going to be for a long time to come.
And Julian, you talk about majorities, and we see a lot in polls or on cable television that much of what we'll call the Democratic Party agenda actually has a fair amount of popular support. And yet Republicans fairly confidently can oppose it and not fear retribution. How does that work as far as the broader democracy goes? How do we get to this point?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is the structure of the Senate and the Electoral College, which favor and benefits smaller states, which has now become really the heart of the Republican coalition. So I think at some level, the GOP, they're not confident. No party is ever confident, but they feel comfortable that they could continue with a strategy that appeals to this constellation of smaller states. And in presidential elections, they'll do well. But in the Senate automatically, gives the same representation to New York as it does to, a smaller state like Wyoming or West Virginia. And you can then continue along the same lines. The filibuster, now that it's a normalized tool as opposed to an exceptional mechanism, gives the minority tons of room to block legislation, and the kind of fundraising apparatus leaves the GOP in healthy shape, even if it's doing things that the majority of the country doesn't want. And then when you have an electorate that's extremely loyal to party, I think a lot of Republicans feel the safe bet is to do what the electorate wants rather than to be brave and try to break with them in any way. And I think there's a real fear if you do that, you're done. But it's a problem. I mean, we're dealing with issues that are not simply, I think, choices, should we do something or not, but we're increasingly dealing with issues that need to be addressed. And there's certain questions, such as, I think, the climate, that are raising concern and stimulating debate about the way the institution is working, because it is not producing any kind of result. And we, as a nation and as a world, keep suffering. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think that's a clash that's taking place.
And what about the sources of information people have? I'm wondering, we know that a lot of people like us, will call ourselves civilians, are picking it up on the internet or the cable television we watch. What about legislators themselves? Where do they get their information from?
I think they get more of it from the same sources. I think that's part of why a lot of congressional politics is so nationalized. I mean, there's many reasons why the local isn't quite as important as people used to say. Some of it is the fundraising is coming from national organizations as opposed to depending on people in your district or your state. But the information is important. We're increasingly having debates where a lot of members of Congress are like, the rest of us. They're either getting it on Twitter, or their staff is getting it on Twitter. They're seeing, you can watch interviews where you can see like cable television in the background, and they're reading the same headlines on the air that the rest of us are. And that both fuels a common conversation about a similar set of issues. The drawback is a lot of issues just get dropped off the agenda, but it also makes sure that the same fault lines, those same divisions, are going to play out in terms of information. And a lot of the information is partisan information. So members of Congress, like the voters, are often getting information that is being presented in a particular point of view to kind of support and strengthen a partisan worldview. And they're often getting information that isn't even true anymore. And they are like the rest of us. I'm not sure there's such a great divide on Capitol Hill between what they are receiving and what the rest of the nation is. I think, President Trump, in some ways, in the White House, embodied how this was working as he got his information from Fox News, and he was a consumer of television. I don't think that's as uncommon a story on Capitol Hill either, in terms of how they're trying to figure out problems.
One thing I was struck by, I was looking at, again, at your great book on Newt Gingrich, how he, at a pretty early age, was able to assert himself as a kind of national figure. You described these conferences he would go to even before he'd been elected to the House. It was defeated a couple of times, I think, running in suburban Georgia. And then he would meet with leaders in the conservative movement, tell them what was on his mind, and suddenly they said, this guy's got something to say. Now, and we should listen to him. And it almost makes you feel as if politics was a little, in some ways, more open then. It was kind of open to ideas, because he was an idea guy. Whatever you thought of the ideas, had them, and he was innovative in his own way. He's kind of a reformer, and it makes you wonder, well, if we shifted now to an era where all these political figures, beginning with the former President Trump, come out of media, they're kind of entertainment figures, whereas he was, he had his PhD and he knew his history, and he kind of, in some ways, came out of a more kind of traditional view of what a political figure should be like and could transform the institution that way. Is there still room for somebody to do that?
I mean, look, as a historian, I'll always say there's always room. It can always happen. We see leaders in all circumstances are able to break at certain moments what the status quo looks like. That is part of what we see from great congressional leaders or other forms of political leaders. We don't know when that's going to happen. It often happens at moments it seems impossible to happen. But it is interesting to think of the 60s through the 80s, meaning starting with the liberal reformers and ending with conservative reformers such as Gingrich, when there was a kind of malleable political world still, where you could see a lot of change happen. You don't have to agree with the change or disagree with the change, but change was possible. New voices could emerge that really transformed the way political business was handled on the Hill. And I don't know right now if I mean, it can happen, but it's very difficult. We talk about the information silos that people live with, all of us in our communities in terms of politics. And I think that is true, not just with information, but just the assumptions of what you can do or shouldn't do in Capitol Hill are very strong. And it's hard to imagine a Republican, for example, totally changing the Senate world that Mitch McConnell has created for the Republican Party. It's just not really easy to see. And at some level, we see the same with the Democrats. Change is very, very difficult right now, and the system seems pretty entrenched. So it won't just take a new visionary leader. It will take a leader who can figure out how do you get through the institutional morass on Capitol Hill and start to change not just hearts and minds, but processes and rules.
Before we get to some questions, let me ask you quickly about two other factors. One is money, how much it costs to run a campaign, to remain in office. And if you've ever talked to congressmen, as you've done and I've done, they will tell you how much of their day is just spent on the phone fundraising, and they're told to do that by their leaders. And the other, what about the role of the primary? You know, that's another change in our system that was supposed to be a great reform when it came through. You'd open the system up, you'd let people participate more, and instead primaries have become in some ways really punitive and dangerous for incumbents or with more moderate members of either party. They feel they're going to be primaried, that verb we use all the time. So talk a little bit about that, money on the one hand and the challenge that comes in the primary on the other.
Well, with money has become I mean, it's important in many ways. One is exactly what you said. If you spend any time with a member of Congress, both parties, this is something they seem to agree with. The amount of time they spend on the phone or in pre-COVID, I assume they're taking new forms either on Zoom, and probably the parties are starting again. But the fundraising, money time, is just a big part of being on Capitol Hill now, and members don't really like it. Some don't like it on principle. That's not what they should be doing. Some, I'm sure, don't like it because they are people who like power. And when you're asking for money from people all the time, you lose that power very quickly. You see who you're beholden to. But it's a problem. It's also a problem, though. It supports some of the partisanship we're talking about. A lot of the groups, again, they're national and they give money if you stick to a certain position. If you don't, the money is gone. And the money often aligns with where the party leadership is. So it's very hard to be a Republican and take a strong stance on gun control as an example, because you're going to, potentially lose a lot of the revenue that you need to survive politically. That is connected to the primary. I mean, a lot of legislators and senators say they spend their time raising huge war chests now that they don't even need. There's no primary challenger to speak of. Many are incumbents who've been in office, but they're so scared that if they say the wrong thing or they have one kind of misstep, that external forces from their state, frankly, could support a local candidate to push them farther to the extreme of their party. And so the primary also fuels the fundraising game, because everyone wants to have lots of money on hand if that primary ever happens. And then finally, yes, the primary, when primaries were created in general, kind of in the early 20th century, primaries are a way to break free from party orthodoxy. And they were seen as a reform, as a way to get new voices into the system. And as late as the 70s in presidential politics, that's what primaries were supposed to do. It was like the bosses aren't going to tell you who to run. People will decide who to run. I'm not sure they function that way. I think now primaries are simply a tool in many ways of the party. And if you're not going to follow the party will punish you in different ways. They will stop getting you money, and they will raise a primary challenge and get you kicked out. And so it's rational if you're a member of Congress to totally follow the party line, in part because of those two processes.
Deb, how are we doing here? Are we have some questions?
Yeah, we actually have a question about money, and that was our first question. So I just want to remind everyone that you can put your question into the chat. We can also take raised hands if you're not able to navigate the chat. So just go ahead. There is a raise hand feature under the reactions button down below. That's also where you'll find the link to the chat to open your chat window. So you can put your questions in the chat, or you could raise your hand. But our first question was about money. And the question was sort of, is there something fundamentally different now? And Julian, you've already answered, addressed that part. But specifically, there was an interest in knowing to what degree are we seeing the effects of Citizens United and influence of big money on creating gridlock?
I mean, Citizens United, which was a decision that opened the floodgates in many ways to big concentrated donations. It was important. I'm not sure it's the reason that we have our money in politics problem. I mean, the problem of campaign finance defined as private contributions and the different ways in which they influence legislative behavior, and more importantly, connected to Michael's question, the way in which they obstruct, they prevent legislators from a certain amount of political bravery that's needed, frankly, to solve big problems. We've been discussing that since the 70s. I mean, the only real reform we had was the presidential system after Watergate. That system, by many accounts, was pretty good. It was pretty successful in restraining some of the influence of money until both parties abandoned it. George W. Bush and Barack Obama both said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to restrain ourselves. We never had that in congressional politics. When Congress reforms presidential campaign finance in '74, it basically doesn't do the same for congressional campaigns. It creates limits on contributions, but the flow of private money continues, and it's only kind of perfected in the 1980s and 90s with all kinds of soft money and independent mechanisms, and those have exploded. So Citizen United was it was one more wrong step if you don't like the system. Some people are happy with the existing system, but if you see it as a problem, I think it was a step in a much bigger multi-decade process where we really failed to deal with congressional campaign finance in any substantial, meaningful way other than disclosure, which believe it or not, we do have much better disclosure rules today than we used to pre-1970s. If you want, you can find out, who's giving money to who. It's not perfect. Certainly these independent groups are finding ways around it, but there's still much more available if you really want to know the flow of money. Just hasn't helped as much as people thought without other reforms.
And Gary Beach has his hand up, so we'll go to Gary now. If you could ask your question, I think you're unmuted.
Thank you very much, Julian. Good job. I've learned a lot listening to you. Just had a quick question on what your thoughts would be about this subject of term limits. It can be done two ways. Either Congress votes term limits on itself or bottoms up. Since I think the mid-90s, a group called termlimits.org has been trying to convince the 50 state legislatures to support it, and then they can have a constitutional amendment. But do you think we'll ever see term limits in our lifetime?
I don't think we're going to see term limits. I mean, the obvious reason is it's hard to overpower incumbents who have no interest in term limits generally, although there's some younger Republicans who are going to be more sympathetic. They come out of an era where this was on the agenda. I think it's a very hard thing. You're asking members of Congress, the House and Senate, to take away power, which is really the biggest commodity that they get into this business for. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Power can be a good thing. It can be used to achieve goals, but they want that power. And if you're term limiting someone, you basically render them powerless almost from the moment they stay in, even if it's a longer term limit than a 2-year, 1-term kind of term limit. I'm not sure it's a good idea either, to be honest. And one of the things I learned there, from studying, I've done a lot on the period from the kind of 30s to the 70s, which certainly is not a perfect period by any stretch, deeply problematic, but there is something to understanding legislative jobs as jobs, and having people who can build relationships over time, who can have a sense of both the way the House and Senate works, as well as have a sense of the dysfunctions that exist in the nature of those institutions. And I would be very worried that if you impose term limits, it's going to actually not just not be great for the institution, it will probably fuel a lot of the behavior that we're talking about. I mean, you can imagine if people kind of have just zero commitment to the institution, they're probably often going to be quite ideological in kind of what they want to do in a short period. They're not going to really know other members very well. They're going to follow whoever has some kind of power and authority. And I'm just not sure it's going to really benefit the institution as a whole. And look, I'm a professor. I believe in expertise. I still do. I believe in knowledge. I believe in experience as being a virtue. And I would hate to have a political system that throws that out the window. I think there's other reforms that are much more important that would make the House and Senate work better.
Thank you.
What are they? Oh, I'm sorry, Dad.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've hinted at them. I mean, I'm not someone who believes the filibuster sacrosanct, and I'm not sure once the filibuster is basically used all the time, I think it's a dysfunctional process. I really do. And I don't think we're not meant to have a Senate that required 60 votes. I don't think having a Senate that requires 60 votes is going to work in this day and age. And it's basically forcing everything to be handled through this weird process of reconciliation, which is not a great way to solve the nation's problems either. And I think, some people want to get rid of the filibuster. Other people want to reform the filibuster, like Norm Ornstein. And there's different kinds of reforms, make it easier to end the filibuster, allow for more carve-outs, different kinds of issues that are not subject to the filibuster. I think that could be very useful. I do believe, we've talked about it a lot, the money in politics problem does need to be addressed. And I think the one place we can go a little bit back to where we were without totally reverting is to try to find ways to give some more authority to committee chairs. So they're not totally kind of creatures of the leadership, which is what they are now. That was a big Gingrich reform and a reform of Democrats the decade earlier. And I think if you have a little bit of autonomy, without as much as we had in the 50s and 60s, it could be healthy, even in a partisan era, to create kind of more voices. The other reform isn't institutional reform. I don't know how you do it. I mean, I think people talk about partisanship versus bipartisanship. That's the binary we talk about. But really, the best hope, and if it was achieved, it would put us in a better place, is what I think of as responsible partisanship. Partisanship where there are certain guardrails of what you can do and what you can't do. A partisanship where there is still a commitment also to governing, that it's not partisanship above everything else. And if there were leaders who could kind of guide the institution through that norm, which doesn't mean getting along with everyone. It doesn't mean dropping the agenda, but putting some guardrails on what you're willing to say and do, and instilling a commitment to ultimately resolving certain questions, even in unsatisfactory ways, that would be huge. And I think in some ways that's what we really need to aim for, rather than some return to bipartisanship, which I just don't see happening right now.
So Julian, it's so interesting that you're talking about bipartisanship, because we do have a question in the chat, which is what about the prospect? What are the prospects for a third party to emerge? And would that change the dynamic in Congress? You know, we're so used to Republicans versus Democrats, that dynamic, but what about, you know, and talking about climate earlier, you know, Greens as a new constituency, you know, do you think that there are prospects for a strong third party to emerge?
I mean, it's hard. That's the most historians, when you ask them that, will say, with reason, it's very unlikely. The parties have a pretty long hold now, the Democrats and the Republicans, on our political system. And it's not simply that people are used to them. They have an infrastructure that's very hard for a third party to compete with. And in this country, we've seen third parties come and go much more than we've seen third parties or new parties totally remake politics. But there are ways in which they can still be quite important. We've seen in local politics how third parties are having some effect, certainly at the local level and the state level. The Green Party is a good example. You could argue, you know, the Democratic Socialist Party, one of the stars of the Democratic Party nationally comes out of that with AOC. The Tea Party wasn't really a third party. I think it was much more connected to the Republican Party, but at the local and state level, I think that's how third parties have an effect. And when they have either allies on the Hill, even if it's a couple of people, or people who are listening to what the third party in their state is saying, it can have an effect. I mean, it might be a kind of new source of pressure that breaks through what your party leader is saying. But it's going to be hard work, because everything really is stacked against those third parties. And they're trying to depend on things like social media and mass fundraising using the internet to try to overcome some of the advantages that the parties have.
We have been talking about, the question was, you know, is Congress broken? But we do have a question here, which is anything in Congress actually working well or better than it has in the past?
Yeah, I mean, look, Congress does do things. I mean, it's been broken. It's always broken. It's pretty much always broken. And I can't tell you how many moments you can look back to, including the moments we look back to nostalgically, and find the same kind of writing about the institution as we do today. And I think generally it's very hard for Congress to get a lot of things done. In addition to all the current problems we've talked about, by design, it's fragmented, it's slow, it requires the buy-in of a lot of people, even in an era of intense partisanship. And so people are often frustrated. It's also very transparent. It's our most transparent form of democracy in many ways. You see exactly what's going on. You see the ugliness of the process. And so I always just start with that premise. But even within that, even in our modern era, let's start in the 1990s through today, it's not as if stuff hasn't happened. You can look at any presidency, and they all do have legacies, whether it's the former President Trump with his tax cut, whether it's Obama in his first years with the healthcare and the stimulus. Congress can produce if it wants, even in this broken, dysfunctional moment. So I don't kind of take off the table the American Rescue Plan. It went into effect. It happened. So Congress is still capable, even with all these problems, of stepping up if the conditions are correct. And I come back to what I said earlier. It's not always nice to see, but I do think we have a much more transparent political system than we used to. And I don't think it was all bad to kind of break up the closed committee rooms and allow television cameras to cover things, and to have disclosure rules that forces members to say where they're earning money. And I think even though that doesn't solve everything, it's better to have that than to have a lack of transparency in our democracy. So that's been, I think, a reform for the good. And I do think, I know it's hard to imagine, but I still hold that there could be something valuable to social media and the ability of members to communicate directly with constituents nationally, and not always to be filtered through a media kind of ecosystem. I don't think it's been used very well. I do think our former president kind of showed us the worst ways to use it in many ways. But I could imagine this becomes a pretty good tool in the future for new forms of communication that improve our democracy. So there are some kind of spots where I could imagine brightness ahead.
Sam, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
Yes, actually, first I wanted to ask Julian, just expanding on his point. We also have a more diverse Congress than we've had before, where more points of view and more identities are presented than we would have imagined a generation ago. And also, on this kind of upbeat note, who are some good legislators right now? Like, you look at them and say, these are people who really kind of get how to do this now in this moment. Is there anybody you see who fits that prescription? Or
yeah, I mean, on the first point, I would echo that. I mean, it's like when you read about the Senate and House in the 50s and 60s, it's the opposite of diverse. I mean, there's just a handful of older white men who are in this institution, and that's not the world in which we live today. It has become a much more diverse place. There's still a lot of room for improvement and change, but you have different perspectives, different voices, and that matters. Congress is not just an institution, it's real people. And so if you have this kind of diversity, such as a female Speaker of the House, that's a big deal that we can easily discount because we focus on all the problems, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't overlook that. She is one I point to, whether you like her or dislike her. She's a very effective speaker in my mind. She has been, she will go in the canon of powerful speakers who are able to really understand not only the nuances of their own party and the opposition, but have a command of how do you move things in this incredibly difficult place. I think a lot of the class of 2018, they were kind of interesting, especially the group of legislators, former military female legislators, who they were at the heart of the impeachment. They wrote that letter, I remember, raising national security concerns. Many of them are quite interesting and kind of trying to figure out a way to be very democratic, meaning represent what a majority of the party wants, but still kind of have a more moderate kind of image or reputation. And so that whole cohort, I think, can be quite interesting. And finally, look, it's not, again, people dislike him very much, but Senator McConnell's an incredibly effective legislator. I mean, he is a senator who I think has just incredible command of the institution and the party. I think President Biden right now, although we talk about Manchin, he's also really dealing with McConnell, who is keeping everyone in line perfectly, who understands that in Congress, the longer you wait, the harder things get to move. And he's playing that kind of a game. And over and over, I am just always really impressed, suggests the normative view of him, which I don't want to say, but certainly impressed with his skill. I think he is one of the most formative Republicans or Democrats, really, who has been in a leadership position for some time. And I think Democrats have been reeling from the effects of a lot of what he does.
In fact, what you really just said, and I've thought about this too, is Nancy Pelosi is probably one of the handful of really effective, great leaders, House speakers, and McConnell's one of the most effective Senate leaders we've ever had. I mean, in some ways, these figures, like them or hate them or be exasperated by them, actually are among the most effective legislators in modern history.
Agreed.
Sorry. Sam,
Yeah.
I did want to get to, we had another question from the audience that I did want to get to. I know that we're right on 6 o'clock here, but Rita Christopher, who Julian, you had a conversation with Rita earlier for her article about you in our local
Yes.
paper. I'm going to ask Rita to unmute because I understand she's been raising her hand, so we'll see if this works.
In uncharacteristically patient fashion, I
Okay.
might ask Deb, I'm worried by the level of polarization in the United States. Does Congress simply react to the polarization or create the polarization?
I think both. I know that's the frustrating answer. I do think members of Congress are responding to what they see in the electorate. There's a lot of members of Congress who, if things look very differently, would be more than happy to act differently. What they want to do is preserve their seats and preserve their ability to have an influence on the debate. And the electorate is quite polarized when it comes to midterm and presidential year voting. That said, they still have a lot of space to define kind of what should partisanship be with their electorate. These are figures who have great sway still with the electorate, who have a platform that we don't have as average voters. And part of what you see with great legislators is sometimes getting a bit ahead of your electorate and doing things that could be politically risky, but are important in terms of policy, and bringing people along. Doesn't mean you turn them from Republicans to Democrats or vice versa, but there is a role, I think, with great senators like Robert Wagner of New York was one of them, to start to kind of, even in a polarized world, move what the party is doing just a little bit. And so they are responsible as well. I think instead what we're often seeing is they kind of just accept the status quo and they play to the worst aspects of our politics right now. And so that just creates a horrible cycle.
So Julian, I think we have all the questions in now, but I just did want to ask you one last question. So politics aside, we know that your new book is not about a politician. And I just was hoping that you could give us sort of a 1 minute quick view of what's in that book. Because it is coming out, and I think that we can, I'm sure that we can order it now, but we would love to have the books here at the library, and we'll be ordering them. But if you could just give us a little preview.
Sure. It just came out yesterday. It was a real labor of love. It's a biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was an immigrant from Warsaw. Comes from a Hasidic Jewish family. Gets his PhD at the University of Berlin in philosophy. And as a result of World War II and the Holocaust, he ends up basically escaping, coming here in 1940. He's a remarkable person. He spends much of the 40s and 50s at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, writing a series of books about the relationship between God and man, what spirituality means in the modern world, and questions of that sort. And by the 1960s, he shifts his attention and is very drawn to the idea that the way to be spiritual, the way to open yourself up to the voice of God, is to participate in the social justice movements of the 60s. And he becomes a very well-known civil rights advocate, a friend of Martin Luther King, marches with him at Selma. He becomes one of the leading voices against the Vietnam War, working with an interfaith group of religious leaders such as William Sloane Coffin and John Bennett to protest the war. And he works on other issues like Soviet Jewry, anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church. He's kind of a remarkable figure in American Jewish history and just in American history more broadly. And so the book's about him, and it's about the role of religion in this period where it was very vibrant and very important. And I wanted to just recapture it through really a remarkable story.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to reading all of your books.
Thank you.
We have a small thank you that is on its way to your office at Princeton.
Okay.
It's, but we have a hearty thank you here from all of us for sharing your time with us. So delightful. And thank you also, Sam. Always a pleasure. Thank you all. And we'll conclude now the annual meeting of the association. So good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you, Sam. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Kathy.
Julian.
Okay,
Okay.
bye-bye.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Kathy.